Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently into the sunlit waters of ancient Mexico, where gardens once floated on lakes, and a civilization built paradise on a foundation of reeds and mud and impossible dreams. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through a world that grew food on water. We glide in wooden canoes past rectangular islands, thick with maize and beans and flowers, their roots drinking from the lake below. We watch farmers tending crops that never touch solid ground, building entire ecosystems from willows and soil dredged from shallow waters. We stand on the shores of Lake Texcoco, where a city rises on an island, connected by causeways so long they seem to touch the horizon, fed by Chinampas so productive they supported hundreds of thousands of people. We imagine the ingenuity it took to transform a swamp into an agricultural marvel, the knowledge passed down through generations about water levels and crop rotation, and the careful balance between lake and land. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles. It's not about memorizing the fall of empires or cataloguing conquistador chronicles. It's about the lives lived. The farmer poling his canoe through morning mist, the woman weaving willow branches into new garden frames, the child learning which plants thrive in wet soil and which need raised beds. It's about the ingenuity whispered through weathered canals and forgotten agricultural wisdom, the innovations that fed an empire and then vanished beneath concrete and modernity. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and a subscribe help. Keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. Before the Spanish came, before Tenochtitlan rose from the water, before the Aztecs claimed dominion over the valley, there was the lake. Actually, there were 5 lakes, linked together in the basin of Mexico like fingers on a hand, surrounded by volcanic peaks that trapped clouds and rain, and created a world apart from the arid plateau beyond. Lake Zumpango to the north, Lake Xaltecan beside it, Lake Texcoco in the centre, vast and slightly saline, its waters glittering under the highland sun, Lake Xochimilco to the south, freshwater and shallow. And Lake Chalco, the smallest, nestled against the mountains. This was the world the Mexica people found when they arrived in the valley in the 13th century, wandering and landless, following prophecies about an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. The good land was already taken. The lakeshores were controlled by established city-states, Culhuacan and Azcapotzalco, powers that had no interest in sharing their fertile ground with refugees and wanderers. So the Mexica did what desperate people often do. They accepted what no one else wanted. They settled on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco, a place where the water was too salty for drinking, where firm ground was scarce, where mosquitoes bred in clouds and the only solid earth was volcanic rock and marsh reed. It should have been a death sentence. Instead, it became the foundation of an empire. But that transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen through conquest alone. It happened through an understanding of water, of mud, of the patient accumulation of earth in a place where earth should not exist. The Mexica looked at the lake and saw not an enemy but a partner. They studied the edges where fresh water met salt, where aquatic plants grew thick and tangled. They watched how sediment settled, how certain reeds stabilized the mud beneath them, how the lake itself could be shaped and directed with the right knowledge. The valley in those early days was a world of water. During the rainy season from May to October, the lake swelled and merged, transforming the basin into an inland sea dotted with islands and crossed by causeways. During the dry season, water levels fell and revealed mudflats and marshes where birds gathered in numbers that darkened the sky. The climate was cooler then than it is now, Mexico City not yet existing to trap heat and pollution. Snow sometimes dusted the peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the Sleeping Woman and the Smoking Mountain, volcanoes that stood guard over the valley like ancient sentinels. The people who lived around the lakes before the Mexica arrived had already begun the work of cultivation. The Toltecs, who claimed descent from the legendary city of Tula, had experimented with building up earth in the shallows, creating raised fields that stayed above the waterline. Other groups constructed platforms of stone and soil, small garden plots that could be tended from canoes. The knowledge was there, fragmented and partial, waiting for someone to see its full potential. The Mexica saw it, or perhaps necessity forced them to see it, hunger being the mother of innovation as much as invention. They had no choice but to farm the lake because the lake was all they had. So they began to build. The earliest Chinampas were simple. Stake out a rectangular plot in the shallow parts of the lake, pile up mud dredged from the lake bottom, weave a fence of woven reeds to hold the mud in place, plant willow trees at the corners, their roots eventually stabilizing the structure, wait for sediment to settle and compact, plant crops in the rich, dark soil that accumulated. It worked. Somehow, impossibly, it worked. The gardens did not actually float, though from a distance they appeared to. They were anchored to the lake bottom by the roots of willows and other water-loving trees, by layers of compressed vegetation and sediment that had accumulated over time, but they existed in a state between earth and water, neither fully land nor fully lake, a human-made ecosystem that depended on understanding the relationship between the two. The Mexica refined the technique over generations. They learned which plants anchored soil best. They discovered how to manage water levels using a complex system of dikes and canals, separating fresh water from salt water, controlling flooding, creating a network of waterways that allowed canoes to reach every Chinampa in the growing system. They developed crop rotation systems that kept the soil productive year after year without depleting it. They used lake sediment, rich in nutrients from decomposing aquatic plants, as a constant source of fertilizer. By the time the Spanish arrived, the Chinampas covered vast stretches of the southern lakes, a green patchwork visible from the mountains that ring the valley. Conservative estimates suggest there were over 20,000 acres of these floating gardens, producing 7 crops a year in some areas, feeding not just Tenochtitlan but the entire network of cities and towns that had grown up around the valley's rim. But in the beginning, there was just water and mud and hungry people willing to try something impossible. There was a valley of 5 lakes, volcanic mountains holding in the clouds, and a group of refugees building Earth where Earth did not exist. The setting was not paradise. It was a swamp, a challenge, a problem that demanded a solution. What the Mexica built there, over centuries of patient work and accumulated knowledge, was not inevitable. It was a choice, renewed every season, every planting, every generation, a choice to see abundance where others saw only obstacles. That choice would shape everything that followed. The rise of Tenochtitlan, the wealth of the Aztec Empire, the agricultural marvel that Spanish soldiers would mistake for enchantment, and eventually the tragedy of what happens when knowledge is dismissed as primitive, when sophisticated systems are destroyed because their logic seems foreign. But that destruction was still centuries away. For now, in those early days, there was just the valley, the lakes, the mountains, and the beginning of something extraordinary growing from mud and water and human determination. November the 8th, 1519. The date matters because it marks the moment when 2 worlds, developing separately for millennia, collided on a mountain pass between 2 volcanoes. Hernán Cortés and his army of Spanish conquistadors, along with thousands of indigenous allies from rival city-states, climbed through pine forests into the thin air of the highlands and emerged at a place where they could look down into the Valley of Mexico. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was there, who marched with sore feet and armour that chafed in the tropical heat, would later struggle to find words for what they witnessed. He wrote that, when they saw the great cities and temples and buildings rising from the water, and the causeways and bridges stretching across the lake, many soldiers said that what they were seeing resembled enchantments from the tale of Amadis, because of the great towers and buildings rising from the water, all made of stonework. Some of the soldiers even asked whether what they saw was not a dream. From their vantage point on the pass, the entire basin spread out below them like a map drawn by gods. Lake Texcoco dominated the centre, its waters reflecting the morning light. The city of Tenochtitlan rose from an island, a geometrical marvel of white temples and stone buildings laid out in perfect order. 3 great causeways connected the island to the mainland, straight as arrows, wide enough for 8 horses to ride abreast. Other cities dotted the shoreline, Texcoco to the east, to Cuba to the west, each substantial enough to rival European capitals. But what truly astonished them were the gardens. The Chinampas covered the southern portion of the lake system, like a vast green carpet, thousands upon thousands of rectangular plots separated by narrow canals that caught the light and turned the landscape into a pattern of earth and water, so regular it seemed designed by a single mind. From the mountain, they looked like they were floating, hovering just above the lake's surface, defying gravity and reason. Cortés had prepared his men for many things. He had told them about gold and glory, about conquering new lands for Spain and converting heathens to Christianity. He had warned them about potential dangers, hostile warriors, tropical diseases, the challenge of fighting so far from reinforcement or retreat. But he had not prepared them for beauty on this scale, for a civilization that could build cities on water, that could farm a lake, that possessed an architectural sophistication that made European cities seem cramped and medieval by comparison. The Spanish had seen the coastal cities, places like Zempoala, with its whitewashed buildings and ordered streets. They had been impressed but not awed. This was different. This was a revelation that challenged everything they thought they knew about the people they had come to conquer. As they descended from the pass, following the southern causeway toward Tenochtitlan, the scale became even more apparent. The Chinampas stretched to either side, each one a carefully tended rectangle of crops. Maize grew in neat rows, taller than a man. Beans climbed up cornstalks in the traditional companion planting method. Squash spread its broad leaves across the ground between them. Tomatoes, chili peppers, amaranth, chia, flowers for the temples and market, all growing in profusion from soil that seemed to float on water. Farmers worked the Chinampas from canoes, poling through the narrow canals between plots. Some were harvesting, others were tending plants, still others were dredging fresh mud from the canal bottoms to replenish the soil. They paused in their work to watch the Spanish pass, these strange pale men in metal shells riding enormous deer, for horses were unknown in the Americas. The Spanish stared back, trying to understand what they were seeing. Some thought the gardens must be built on platforms, wooden rafts covered with earth. Others theorized there must be posts driven into the lake bottom, supporting the soil from below. A few, more imaginative or perhaps more open to wonder, thought they might be witnessing genuine magic, the sorcery they had been warned pagans could command. None of them guessed the truth, that the gardens were held in place by living roots, that they represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about soil and water and plant biology, that what they were seeing was not magic but science, not enchantment but engineering refined through generations of practice. As they reached the causeway itself, the procession slowed. The causeway was a marvel in its own right, built of stone and packed earth, raised above the water level, wide and smooth enough for heavy traffic. Drawbridges spanned gaps at regular intervals, allowing canoes to pass beneath while also serving as defensive choke points that could be raised to isolate the city from land. The Spanish, with military minds, noted this detail with unease. They also noted the people. Thousands of Mexica lined the causeway and the shores, watching the strangers approach their capital. Some were curious, others wary. Children pointed at the horses. Nobles in elaborate feathered cloaks observed with careful neutrality. Messengers standing ready to carry news to the emperor. The crowd was orderly, controlled, not hostile but not welcoming either, waiting to see what these pale strangers wanted, why they had come to the heart of the Mexica world. Cortés rode at the head of the column, trying to project confidence, trying not to show how the sight of Tenochtitlan had shaken him. He was a conqueror, a man who had burned his ships on the coast to force his men forward, who had allied with the Mexica's enemies and marched into the interior against orders from his superiors. He needed to be certain, decisive, in control. But even Cortés, ambitious and ruthless as he was, must have felt some doubt in that moment. How do you conquer a city that builds gardens on water, that commands the loyalty of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, that possesses wealth and knowledge, an organizational capacity that equals or surpasses anything in Europe? The morning sun climbed higher. The causeway stretched ahead, leading to the great island city, and on either side the Chinampas lay green and impossible, a testament to what human beings could build when they understood their environment rather than simply trying to dominate it. The Spanish continued forward, toward the meeting that would change history. Behind them, on the Chinampas, farmers returned to their work. Crops needed tending, regardless of what strangers walked the causeways. The gardens had survived wars and droughts and political upheaval before. They would survive this too, or so it seemed, in November 1519, when the conquest had not yet begun and the floating gardens still covered the southern lakes like a promise of abundance that would last forever. The letters home began almost immediately. Spanish soldiers, camped in Tenochtitlan as guests of the Emperor Moctezuma, wrote to families in Extremadura and Castile, in Andalusia and Aragon, trying to explain what they had found. They described streets of water instead of stone, buildings taller than the cathedrals they had known as children, markets larger than those in Salamanca or Seville, and gardens that somehow grew on the surface of a lake. Their words struggled to contain the reality. How do you explain the impossible to people who have never left villages where the tallest structure is a church steeple? How do you describe agricultural abundance achieved without ploughs or draft animals, without the farming methods that had sustained European civilization for millennia? Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the soldier chronicler, wrote that Tenochtitlan was larger than Rome or Constantinople, that its markets displayed goods they had no names for, fruits and vegetables unknown in Europe, textiles woven in patterns that hurt the eyes with their complexity. He described the Chinampas as gardens built on rafts, because that was the closest approximation his mind could construct. Floating gardens. The phrase appears again and again in the early Spanish accounts, a shorthand for something they saw but could not quite comprehend. Cortés himself sent letters to King Charles III of Spain, careful political documents that balanced wonder with confidence, astonishment with the assurance that conquest was still possible despite the sophistication of what he had found. He described the city's grandeur, its wealth, the gold and precious stones in the emperor's palace, but he also described the Chinampas, recognizing them as something strategically important, a source of food production that sustained the Mexica military power. He wrote that the Mexica had gardens in the water where they grew vegetables and plants, that these gardens were made on wooden rafts covered with earth, and that they moved from place to place to be near fresh water. He was wrong about the rafts, wrong about them moving, but his instinct was correct. The gardens were indeed strategically vital, the foundation of Tenochtitlan's ability to sustain a massive urban population. Back in Spain, readers encountered these letters with skepticism. The Spanish court was accustomed to explorers exaggerating their discoveries, inflating the wealth and wonder of new lands to justify continued investment and support. Stories of floating gardens sounded like fantasy, like the tall tales sailors told in taverns, embellishments designed to make the teller seem more worldly and adventurous. Some clerics worried that the soldiers were succumbing to indigenous sorcery, that what they described as gardens were actually demonic illusions designed to corrupt Christian souls. Others, more practical, suspected that Cortés was simply lying, making up stories about impossible cities to cover up his unauthorized invasion and keep the gold flowing back to his coffers rather than the king's. Even those who believed the letters struggled to understand them. A city built on a lake made sense if you imagined it like Venice, with buildings on pilings driven into shallow water, streets replaced by canals, but gardens that floated, agriculture conducted from boats. It violated everything Europeans knew about farming, about the relationship between cultivation and solid earth. The skepticism was not limited to distant Spain. Even among the conquistadors themselves, there were debates about what they were seeing. Some insisted the Chinampas must be built on hidden platforms of stone, that the Mexica were simply hiding the true structure beneath a covering of plants and soil. Others argued for a more mystical explanation, that the indigenous priests had bound spirits to hold the earth above water, that the gardens would collapse if the Mexica religion was destroyed. A few, perhaps the most observant or most open-minded, noticed details that hinted at the truth. They saw the willow trees planted at the corners of each Chinampa, their roots trailing into the water. They noticed how farmers constantly dredged mud from the canals and spread it across the garden plots, maintaining fertility. They observed that the Chinampas did not actually move, that each one occupied a fixed location in the lake, contradicting Cortés's claim about rafts that shifted position. But observation without context leads to incomplete understanding. The Spanish could see what the Mexica did, but they lacked the cultural knowledge, the agricultural wisdom, the accumulated experience that explained why it worked. They saw farmers planting maize and beans together in the same plot and thought it wasteful, not understanding the nitrogen-fixing properties of legumes or the structural support the maize stalks provided for climbing beans. They saw the constant transfer of lake mud and thought it mere maintenance, not recognizing it as a sophisticated system of nutrient cycling that kept the Chinampas productive year after year. One soldier, whose name is lost to history, wrote a letter describing the morning mist rising from the lakes, how the Chinampas seemed to float in that mist like islands in the sky, how the canoe traffic moved through the fog like ghosts. He wrote about watching a farmer and his young son working a Chinampa at dawn, the two of them moving in practiced rhythm, the boy learning the knowledge his father had learned from his grandfather, a chain of understanding stretching back generations. That letter captures something the more formal accounts missed: the human element. The fact that behind the architectural marvel and agricultural innovation were people, families who had tended these same plots for decades, who knew the rhythms of the lake as intimately as a sailor knows the sea. Children who grew up learning to pole a canoe before they could properly walk on land. Women who selected seeds and planned rotations and understood soil texture by feel. Elders who carried in their memories the accumulated wisdom of how to read weather patterns, when to plant, when to harvest, how to coax abundance from floating earth. The letters home, for all their limitations and misunderstandings, preserved a moment before destruction. They captured, however imperfectly, the Spanish response to encountering a civilization that had solved problems Europe had never faced, using methods Europe had never imagined. Disbelief, wonder, suspicion, awe, all these emotions tangled together in those letters. The writers knew they were seeing something extraordinary, even if they lacked the framework to fully understand it. They knew the gardens should not work, could not work according to European agricultural knowledge, and yet there they were, feeding hundreds of thousands, producing abundance from water and mud. In the archives of Spain, those letters still exist, yellowed and fragile, written in fading ink by hands that held swords and crosses that had come to conquer and convert. They are imperfect documents, coloured by bias and misunderstanding, written by men who saw the Chinampas through a lens of European assumptions, but they are also witness testimony, evidence that the floating gardens were real, were vast, were productive beyond anything comparable in the Europe of that era. That they existed not as primitive agriculture, but as sophisticated cultivation, elegant in its logic, sustainable in its practice. The readers back in Spain did not believe, but that disbelief does not change what was real. The gardens floated impossible and undeniable under the Mexican sun, and the Mexica tended them, as they had for generations, as they believed they would for generations to come. They did not yet know that the men writing those letters of wonder would soon become agents of the garden's destruction. There is a fundamental principle of European agriculture that the Spanish brought with them to the Americas, a principle so basic it seemed like natural law rather than cultural practice. Farming requires land, solid, stable earth, preferably flat, or at least gently rolling. Soil that stays where you put it, that does not shift with tides or flood with rains beyond what drainage ditches can manage. Everything in European agricultural tradition reinforced this principle. The three-field system that had sustained medieval farming depended on rotating crops through permanent plots of solid ground. Ploughing, the foundation of European cultivation, required earth firm enough to support the weight of oxen and wooden ploughs stable enough to hold furrows from season to season. Even innovations like terracing mountainsides or reclaiming marshland through drainage still assumed that once you created farmland, it stayed put, grounded in bedrock or clay or compacted soil. The Chinampas violated this principle completely. They existed in a state of permanent contradiction, neither fully land nor fully water, held together by roots and reeds and layers of decomposing vegetation rather than geological permanence. By every rule of European agriculture, they should not work. The soil should wash away. The structures should collapse. The crops should fail, roots drowning in water, unable to find the solid earth they needed. But they did not fail. They thrived. And this contradiction bothered the Spanish in ways that went beyond simple confusion. It was not just that the Mexica had developed a different agricultural system. Different systems existed throughout Europe itself, variations in crop types and planting schedules adapted to local climates and soils. What bothered the Spanish, what created a cognitive dissonance that some never resolved, was that the Chinampas were not simply different but apparently superior, more productive per unit of space, more sustainable over time, more elegant in their integration with the natural environment. This was not supposed to be possible. European civilization in 1519 considered itself the pinnacle of human achievement. Christianity had triumphed over paganism. Classical learning had been preserved and was being rediscovered in the Renaissance. Europeans had ships that could cross oceans, weapons that could shatter stone walls, a theological and philosophical tradition stretching back to ancient Greece and Rome. The people they encountered in the Americas, according to prevailing European thought, should be primitive. Noble savages, perhaps, innocent in their simplicity, but fundamentally inferior in knowledge and capability. The discovery that these primitive people had created an agricultural system more sophisticated than anything in Europe challenged this worldview at its foundation. Some Spanish observers simply denied what they saw. They insisted the Chinampas must be worked by demons, that Satan had given the Mexica false knowledge to lead them away from God. If the gardens worked, it was through evil rather than ingenuity. This explanation preserved European superiority while acknowledging the evidence of their eyes. Others took a different approach. They argued that the Chinampas, impressive as they were, represented the best the Mexica could achieve given their lack of proper animals and tools. Yes, the gardens produced abundant crops, but imagine how much more productive they would be with European ploughs and draft animals. This explanation allowed them to admire the gardens, while still maintaining that European methods were fundamentally superior. A few, very few, looked at the Chinampas and recognized them for what they were, a solution to a specific environmental challenge that was potentially more sustainable than European agriculture. These observers, mostly priests and scholars rather than soldiers, began asking questions. How did the Mexica keep the soil from washing away? Why did crops grow so well in earth that was constantly wet? What did farmers use for fertilizer when there were no cattle or horses to provide manure? The answers they received challenged European assumptions in systematic ways. The soil did not wash away because it was held in place by a matrix of living roots, willow and cypress, and other water-loving trees that stabilized the structure while also drawing up nutrients from the lake. Crops grew well precisely because of the constant moisture, the rich sediment dredged from canal bottoms, the careful management of water levels that prevented both flooding and drought. Fertilizer came from the lake itself. Aquatic plants decomposed and enriched the sediment. Human waste was collected from the city and composted with lake vegetation before being spread on the Chinampas, creating a closed-loop system that recycled nutrients rather than depleting them. Even the small fish that lived in the canals contributed, their waste adding nitrogen to the water that fed the plants. It was, some of the more thoughtful observers realized, a complete ecosystem, not nature-tamed or dominated, but nature-partnered with, understood and worked with rather than against. The Mexica had not conquered the lake. They had learned its rhythms, its cycles, its possibilities, and adapted their agriculture to work within those parameters rather than trying to reshape the environment to match imported assumptions. This was perhaps the deepest contradiction. European agriculture was extractive. It took from the soil until the soil was depleted, then either moved on to new land or waited for fields to lie fallow and recover. The Chinampas were regenerative. The same plots produced crop after crop, year after year, generation after generation, without declining in fertility because the system constantly replenished what it took. The Spanish, even those who understood what they were seeing, struggled to accept its implications. If indigenous people in the Americas had developed agricultural methods superior to European ones, what did that mean about European superiority in general? If pagan farmers working without scripture or classical learning could achieve such results, what did that say about the relationship between Christianity and human knowledge? These were uncomfortable questions, especially for conquistadors whose entire enterprise depended on the assumption that they represented civilization bringing light to darkness. Much easier to destroy what they did not understand than to admit that understanding might be found in unexpected places, among people they had come to conquer and convert. And so the contradiction remained, documented but never fully resolved. The Chinampas should not work. They violated principles of agriculture that Europeans considered fundamental. But they did work, undeniably, producing abundance that fed an empire. That contradiction would ultimately be resolved not through understanding but through destruction. If the gardens made no sense according to European logic, then European logic would remake the landscape until it did make sense. until there was solid ground where water had been, until farming looked the way farming was supposed to look. The consequences of that resolution would echo for centuries. But in 1519, the contradiction still stood, green and impossible, challenging anyone who looked closely enough to question what they thought they knew about the relationship between human cultivation and the natural world. The question of how the Chinampas worked became the subject of scholarly debate almost immediately, and that debate continued for centuries after the conquest, pursued by men who would never see a working Chinampa because working Chinampas no longer existed. The earliest theory, put forward by Spanish priests in the generation after conquest, held that the gardens were indeed floating rafts, exactly as Cortés had described them. This theory had the advantage of simplicity. Rafts made sense to European minds. Build a wooden frame, cover it with earth, plant crops, move it when needed. The priests added theological interpretation. The Mexica, lacking divine guidance, had been forced to develop clever but ultimately flawed agricultural methods. The rafts worked after a fashion, but represented a limited solution compared to what could be achieved with proper European farming on solid ground. This theory persisted for nearly 300 years, repeated in history books and encyclopedias, taught in schools across the Spanish Empire. It was wrong, but it was comfortable. It preserved European superiority while acknowledging indigenous ingenuity within appropriate limits. The first serious challenge came in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, when European scholars began applying scientific methods to historical questions. Alexander von Humboldt, the great Prussian naturalist, visited Mexico between 1803 and 1804. He examined the surviving Chinampas in Xochimilco, interviewed elderly farmers who still maintained traditional techniques, and concluded that the floating raft theory was nonsense. Humboldt's account described the Chinampas as he found them: rectangular plots of land, clearly fixed in position, surrounded by canals, planted with willow trees whose roots anchored the structures to the lake bottom. He measured them, sketched them, collected soil samples. His conclusion was definitive. The Chinampas were not rafts. They were reclaimed land, built up from the lake bottom through patient accumulation of sediment and vegetation, stabilized by living roots. This should have settled the question. Humboldt was respected throughout Europe, his scientific credentials impeccable. But the floating raft theory had become so embedded in European understanding of the Mexica that many scholars simply rejected his findings. Some suggested he had been misled by indigenous informants who did not understand their own history. Others argued that the Chinampas he observed in Xochimilco were degraded versions of the original structures, that the true floating gardens of Tenochtitlan had been something different, something lost. A third theory emerged in the 19th century, proposed by Mexican historians seeking to reclaim and reinterpret their own history. They suggested the Chinampas represented a sophisticated form of hydraulic agriculture, comparable to irrigation systems in ancient Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley. The Mexica, according to this theory, had been master engineers who understood water management at a level that rivaled or exceeded European capabilities. This theory elevated the Chinampas from clever primitive adaptation to genuine technological achievement. It also aligned with nationalist sentiments in newly independent Mexico, providing a source of pride in indigenous accomplishment. But it too suffered from the lack of living examples to study. By the 1800s, most of the Chinampa system had been destroyed. The lakes were being drained, Mexico City expanding onto the former lake bed. The few remaining Chinampas in Xochimilco were marginal survivors, worked by poor farmers using simplified versions of traditional methods. Debates continued in academic journals and scholarly conferences. Were the Chinampas unique to the Mexica, or did similar systems exist in other parts of Mesoamerica? Some researchers pointed to raised field agriculture in Maya territories, in the wetlands of Tabasco and Belize, suggesting a broader tradition of wetland cultivation. Others insisted the Mexica version was distinctive, more sophisticated, better adapted to the specific conditions of the Valley of Mexico. How productive were the Chinampas, really? Spanish accounts claimed they produced multiple crops per year, yields that seemed impossible by European standards. Some historians took these claims at face value, citing them as evidence of Mexica agricultural genius. Others dismissed them as exaggeration, arguing that the Spanish had inflated productivity estimates to justify their conquest, to make it seem like they had defeated a wealthier and more advanced civilization. The question of sustainability became particularly contentious in the 20th century, as modern agriculture faced increasing criticism for depleting soils and degrading ecosystems. Were the Chinampas truly sustainable, capable of producing high yields indefinitely without environmental damage? Or would they have eventually depleted the lake ecosystem, collapsed under their own success? Some scholars argued for perfect sustainability, describing the Chinampas as a pre-industrial example of organic permaculture, a closed-loop system that worked with nature rather than against it. They pointed to the constant replenishment of nutrients from lake sediment, the integration of fish and plant cultivation, the absence of chemical fertilizers or pesticides. Others cautioned against romanticizing the past. The Mexica were humans, not ecological saints. They had caused environmental damage in other ways, decimating local forests for timber and fuel. Why assume their agriculture was perfectly sustainable when their other resource extraction clearly was not? Perhaps the Chinampas worked well for centuries, but would have eventually faced problems, soil salinization or nutrient depletion or structural degradation, that only seemed permanent because the conquest interrupted the system before such problems emerged. The debates revealed as much about the debaters as about the Chinampas themselves. European historians tended to emphasize the limitations of indigenous agriculture, finding ways to diminish or explain away its achievements. Mexican nationalists tended toward celebration, claiming the Chinampas as proof of pre-Hispanic superiority in multiple domains. Environmental historians saw in them what they wanted to see, either a sustainable utopia or a cautionary tale about the limits of any agricultural system. What none of them could do, for most of history, was actually study working Chinampas at scale, observe them through complete seasonal cycles, measure productivity and sustainability with scientific rigor. The evidence was fragmentary, colonial-era descriptions written by people who did not fully understand what they were seeing, archaeological remnants under layers of volcanic ash and urban development, the surviving plots in Xochimilco increasingly marginal and modified. It was not until the late 20th century when researchers finally began systematic studies of the Xochimilco Chinampas using modern ecological and archaeological methods that some questions began to find solid answers, and even then certainty remained elusive. Too much had been lost, too much time had passed. The theories multiplied rather than converging. Each generation of scholars brought new methods, new questions, new assumptions. The Chinampas that should not float, that contradicted European agricultural wisdom, continued to contradict easy answers even centuries after most of them had vanished. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some human achievements resist simple explanation, remaining complex and multi-layered, revealing different facets depending on who looks and when and why. The floating gardens of Tenochtitlan were real. Beyond that, the arguments continue. The modern archaeological investigation of the Chinampas began not with grand expeditions but with mud. Lots of mud. Layers of it, compressed and preserved beneath Mexico City, holding secrets about how the Mexica transformed a lake into a garden. In 1974, a team of archaeologists started systematic excavations in Xochimilco, one of the few areas where Chinampas still existed in some form. The work was painstaking, unglamorous, and absolutely necessary. Centuries of Spanish colonial records and scholarly theories had failed to conclusively answer basic questions about Chinampa construction. The only way forward was to dig carefully, documenting every layer. What they found was more complex than anyone had imagined. The Chinampas were not built all at once, as some theories had suggested. They grew, layer by patient layer, over years or even decades. A farmer would stake out a rectangular plot in the shallows, perhaps 10 meters wide by 90 meters long, those sizes varied. Then the accumulation began, aquatic vegetation, cut from the lake and piled within the staked boundary, mud, dredged from the lake bottom and spread across the vegetation. More vegetation, more mud, building up in alternating layers like a complex geological formation. The excavations revealed these layers clearly. Distinct strata of compressed plant matter and sediment, some plots showing 20 or more separate episodes of construction and replenishment. Radiocarbon dating of organic material within the layers allowed researchers to track the chronology, to see how individual Chinampas had evolved over time, but the most important discovery was what held it all together. The roots. willow trees, a huehuete cypress, and other water-loving species planted at the edges and corners of each Chinampa sent roots down through the accumulated layers into the lake bottom itself, creating a living network that stabilized the entire structure. As the trees matured, their roots expanded, forming an increasingly dense matrix that prevented erosion and held soil in place even during the violent storms that periodically swept across the valley. This explained why the Chinampas had seemed to float to Spanish observers. They did exist in a liminal state, neither fully land nor fully lake. The bottom portions of a Chinampa, the oldest layers, were indeed anchored to the lake floor, but the upper portions, where crops grew, could be a metre or more above the water level, held up by the compressed vegetation and root network below. From a distance, especially in morning mist, they appeared to hover above the water surface. The investigation expanded to include paleobotanical analysis, studying preserved pollen and plant remains to determine what crops the Mexica had grown and in what combinations. The findings challenged assumptions about indigenous agriculture. The Chinampas had supported incredible diversity: maize, beans, squash, the traditional three sisters of Mesoamerican farming, but also tomatoes, chili peppers, amaranth chia, flowers for ceremonies and for sale in urban markets, medicinal plants, vegetables whose names had been lost along with the culture that cultivated them. Researchers also discovered evidence of sophisticated crop rotation and intercropping systems. Different sections of a Chinampa, planted with complementary species that supported each other's growth, followed by careful rotation to prevent soil depletion. The Mexica had understood companion planting centuries before European agricultural scientists developed formal theories about it. Soil analysis revealed another crucial insight. The sediment dredged from the canals was not ordinary mud. It was extraordinarily rich in nutrients, organic matter from decomposing aquatic plants, minerals washed down from the volcanic mountains surrounding the valley. Every time farmers spread fresh canal sediment across their Chinampas, they were essentially adding natural fertilizer, replenishing what crops had taken from the soil. The investigation moved from Xochimilco to other sites, using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies to map the full extent of the ancient Chinampa system buried beneath Mexico City's urban sprawl. The results were staggering. At its height, the Chinampa network had covered at least 12,000 hectares, possibly twice that. Conservative estimates suggested it could have fed 200,000 people, perhaps many more. Experimental archaeology added another dimension to the investigation. In the 1980s, researchers created new Chinampas using traditional methods, documented in colonial-era sources and preserved in the memories of elderly Xochimilco farmers. They planted crops, monitored growth, measured yields, tracked nutrient levels in soil and water over multiple seasons. The experiments confirmed what the Spanish had reported, but modern scholars had doubted. The productivity was real. Under optimal conditions, Chinampas could produce up to 7 crops per year in the benign climate of highland Mexico. Yields per hectare exceeded those of contemporary traditional farming in the region by factors of 3 or 4 or more. But the experiments also revealed limitations that historical accounts had not mentioned. Managing a Chinampa required constant labour. Weeding, harvesting, dredging, spreading sediment, maintaining canal edges, pruning trees, monitoring water levels. A single Chinampa might occupy a family full-time. The high productivity came at a cost in human effort. There were also technical challenges that only became apparent through hands-on work. Water levels had to be carefully controlled. Too high and crops drowned. Too low and the Chinampa structure could dry out and destabilize. The Mexica had managed this through an elaborate system of dikes and sluice gates, controlling the flow of water through different sections of the lake, separating fresh water from salt water, preventing flooding during rainy season. Maintaining that hydraulic infrastructure required organizational capacity at a state level, coordinated work by thousands of laborers, engineering knowledge that had to be transmitted across generations. The Chinampas were not just agricultural plots, they were components of a massive integrated system that depended on political stability and centralized control. This realization complicated the narrative. The floating gardens represented remarkable ingenuity and sustainability, but they also depended on the empire that had created them. When that empire fell, when Spanish conquest disrupted the political and social structures that maintained the hydraulic system, The Chinampas could not survive in their original form. The investigation continues. New technologies, from satellite imagery to DNA analysis of preserved seeds, keep revealing new details about how the Chinampas functioned, but the core questions have been answered. We know now, with scientific certainty, what the Spanish could only observe and wonder at. The gardens did not float, but they existed in that liminal space between earth and water. They were built by human hands, but sustained by natural processes the Mexica had learned to partner with. They represented one of the most productive and sustainable agricultural systems ever developed, proof that indigenous knowledge could rival or exceed European accomplishment. The investigation pieced together truth from fragments, from mud and roots and fading memories. What emerged was not a simple story, but a complex portrait of human ingenuity, of a civilization that looked at a lake and saw possibility, of knowledge refined through centuries into something beautiful and functional, and for a time, abundant beyond measure. The physical evidence survives, scattered and partial, fragments of a world that should have vanished completely. In the archives of Seville, in Spain's Archive of the Indies, there are maps, colonial-era maps drawn by Spanish engineers tasked with draining the lakes, maps that show the extent of the Chinampa system before destruction began. They are technical documents, created for practical purposes, which makes them more reliable than romantic accounts. The cartographers marked every canal, every causeway, every area of cultivated land. The maps show a vast grid covering the southern portion of the valley, geometrical precision extending for kilometres in every direction. One map, dated 1569, just 50 years after first contact, shows Chinampas still intact despite the conquest, still being worked by indigenous farmers who had survived the wars and diseases that had killed so many. The Spanish official who commissioned the map noted in marginalia that these gardens produced food for the colonial city, that they remained economically vital, even as the culture that created them was being systematically destroyed. In Mexico City's National Museum of Anthropology, there are artifacts, stone implements used for digging and dredging carved from volcanic basalt, wooden stakes that once marked Chinampa boundaries, preserved in mud that lacked oxygen for bacterial decomposition, remnants of woven reed mats that formed the initial framework for new Chinampas. These objects are humble, utilitarian, the tools of farmers rather than the treasures of emperors, but they tell a story the golden masks and jade ornaments cannot. They speak to daily labour, to generations of people building earth where earth should not exist. There are also the agricultural tools themselves, paddles carved from single pieces of wood for propelling canoes through narrow canals, obsidian blades set in wooden handles for cutting aquatic vegetation, baskets woven so tightly they could carry mud without leaking, each tool refined through use, its shape determined by function, elegant in the way tools become when form follows necessity over centuries. The most important physical evidence, though, lies beneath the ground. Mexico City is built on the remains of Tenochtitlan, which was built on the Chinampas and lake that preceded it. Every time workers dig foundations for new buildings, every time subway tunnels are excavated, they encounter evidence of what existed before. In 1978, workers installing sewer pipes in the neighbourhood of Iztapalapa uncovered a remarkably preserved Chinampa, buried under metres of volcanic ash and urban fill. Archaeologists were called in. They excavated carefully, documenting the structure layer by layer. What they found was a cross-section through time, the accumulated history of one small plot of land. The bottom layer, resting on the old lake bed, was mostly clay and volcanic sediment washed down from the mountains. Above that, alternating strata of plant matter and mud, each layer representing a separate episode of construction or replenishment. Near the top, just below the modern disturbance, they found evidence of cultivation. Preserved maize stalks, their roots still embedded in ancient soil, beans, amaranth seeds, traces of squash vines, and running through the entire structure, the fossilized remnants of willow roots, a network of organic cables that had once held everything together. Radiocarbon dating placed the Chinampas' construction in the early 1400s, more than a century before Spanish arrival. It had been worked continuously for at least 150 years, possibly longer, before being abandoned sometime in the late 1500s, buried by volcanic eruptions and flooding, and the deliberate draining of the lake system. But the most compelling evidence exists above ground, in Xochimilco, where Chinampas still function. They are not the same as their pre-conquest predecessors, modified and simplified over centuries, adapted to serve modern market demands rather than feeding an empire. But they work. Farmers still pole canoes through canals, still plant crops in soil held together by willow roots, still dredge mud and spread it across plots that have been continuously cultivated for 600 years or more. Visitors can see them, take boat tours through the canals, observe methods that have changed less than almost any other aspect of Mexican culture. The Chinampas of Xochimilco were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987, recognized as both a cultural and agricultural treasure, one of the few surviving examples of ancient farming techniques still in active use. The farmers who work them are living evidence, carriers of knowledge passed from parent to child across countless generations. They know things that cannot be learned from books, how to read the water determining by its colour and movement whether canal sediment is ready for harvest, how to judge soil texture by feel, knowing when a chinampa needs fresh mud and when it needs to rest, when to plant based not on calendar dates but on the behaviour of migratory birds, the flowering of certain aquatic plants, signs that the seasons are changing in ways thermometers and rainfall charts cannot capture. There are photographs, too, taken throughout the 19th and 20th centuries by travellers and anthropologists and artists, drawn to Xochimilco's pastoral beauty. Early photographs show Chinampas in their thousands, the canals crowded with flower-laden canoes heading to Mexico City's markets. Later photographs document decline, urban sprawl encroaching, water quality deteriorating, the number of working farmers diminishing with each passing decade. But even these photographs of decline are evidence. They show adaptation, continuity, the stubborn persistence of a system that refuses to die completely, despite centuries of neglect and active suppression. The Chinampas in the photographs are smaller than their ancient predecessors, simpler in construction, worked with modern tools as well as traditional methods. But they are recognizably the same, the core knowledge intact. In the National Autonomous University of Mexico, researchers maintain seed banks preserving varieties of maize and other crops that were cultivated on Chinampas for centuries. Genetic analysis of these seeds reveals traits selected specifically for Chinampa conditions, varieties that thrive in constantly moist soil, that resist diseases common in wetland environments, that produce well in the dense planting patterns Chinampa cultivation required. These seeds are evidence of agricultural science, of selective breeding conducted over generations, of Mexica farmers who understood heredity and adaptation, even if they would not have used those terms. They are proof that what the Spanish found was not primitive or accidental, but the result of deliberate, systematic knowledge applied over centuries. All of this evidence, from colonial maps to living Chinampas, from excavated tools to preserved seeds, tells the same story. The floating gardens were real, they were vast, they were productive, they represented agricultural knowledge that equals or exceeds anything comparable in human history. The evidence is fragmentary, incomplete, distorted by time and conquest, and intentional destruction. But it is enough to reconstruct, at least in outline, what existed, enough to prove that the Spanish accounts, as filtered and biased as they were describing something that actually happened, enough to honour the achievement of the people who built gardens on water and fed an empire from earth that should not exist. The true marvel of the Chinampas was not that they existed, but that they worked at scale. A single floating garden is impressive, a technology demonstration, a clever solution to a specific problem. But thousands of Chinampas, integrated into a coordinated system producing food for one of the largest cities on Earth in the 15th century, that represents something else entirely, that requires not just individual knowledge but collective organisation, not just innovation, but sustained transmission of complex information across generations. Tenochtitlan in 1519 had a population that scholars estimate between 200,000 and 400,000 people, though the exact number remains disputed. Even taking the conservative estimate, that is a massive urban population for the pre-industrial world. London in the same period had roughly 50,000 inhabitants, Paris perhaps 100,000. Only Constantinople rivaled or exceeded Tenochtitlan in size. But unlike European cities which drew food from vast agricultural hinterlands extending hundreds of kilometres, Tenochtitlan was built on an island in a lake. The causeways that connected it to the mainland were busy with traffic but limited in capacity. Moving food into the city in quantities sufficient to feed hundreds of thousands required solutions European cities never faced. The Chinampas were that solution. They transformed the lake itself into a source of sustenance, bringing food production directly adjacent to where people lived. Conservative estimates suggest the Chinampa system at its height produced enough food to sustain the majority of Tenochtitlan's population, supplemented by tribute from conquered territories, but not dependent on it. This was the deeper mystery that modern researchers struggled to understand. Not how individual Chinampas worked, that question had been answered, but how the system as a whole functioned, how knowledge was transmitted, how labour was organised, how productivity was maintained at scale over centuries. Part of the answer lay in the Calpulli system, the Mexica form of social organisation. Calpulli were kinship groups, extended families and clans that held land collectively, distributed plots to member families, organised collective labour for tasks beyond individual capacity. Each Calpulli controlled sections of the Chinampa system, maintained their own canals, managed their own water levels. This decentralised organisation meant that knowledge was embedded in communities, transmitted through apprenticeship and practice rather than written manuals. A child growing up in a Chinampa farming family learned by doing, starting with simple tasks and gradually taking on more responsibility. By the time they were adults, they had internalised knowledge about soil management, crop timing, water control, all the myriad details that made Chinampa agriculture work. But decentralisation alone could not explain the system's success. There had to be coordination at higher levels. The hydraulic infrastructure, the dikes and sluice gates that controlled water flow through different sections of the lake, required centralised planning and maintenance. Someone had to make decisions about when to open or close gates, when to dredge major canals, how to respond to floods or droughts. Evidence suggests this coordination was provided by the Mexica state, specifically by officials responsible for managing water and agriculture. Colonial-era sources mention such officials, though details are scarce. They seem to have had authority to command labour for infrastructure projects, to adjudicate disputes between different Calpulli over water access, to enforce standards for Chinampa construction and maintenance. This points to something remarkable. The Chinampas were neither purely communal nor purely state-controlled, but a hybrid system that combined local autonomy with centralised coordination. Individual families managed their own plots using knowledge passed down through generations. Calpulli coordinated at the community level. The state provided infrastructure and resolved conflicts. Each level had specific roles and responsibilities that made the whole system function. The productivity numbers, verified through modern experiments and historical accounts, remain staggering. A well-managed Chinampa could produce multiple crops per year, with yields per hectare that exceeded conventional agriculture by factors of 3 or more. Maize, the staple grain, could be harvested 3 or even 4 times annually from the same plot. Vegetables and other crops followed even faster rotations. This constant productivity was possible because of the Chinampa's unique characteristics. The soil never depleted because it was constantly replenished with nutrient-rich sediment from the canals. Water was always available, eliminating the risk of crop failure from drought. The climate in the Valley of Mexico, at 2,200 meters elevation but near the tropics, provided year-round growing conditions. Frost was rare, the sun was strong, rain fell predictably during summer months. But high productivity created new challenges. Producing so much food required enormous amounts of labour. Every harvest needed hands to pick it. Every plot needed constant tending. Dredging canals, spreading mud, weeding, pruning trees, maintaining canal edges. All of this work was ongoing, never finished, a cycle that repeated endlessly. The Mexica solved this through their tribute system. Conquered cities and regions sent not just goods, but people, labourers who worked on state projects including Chinampa maintenance. This supplemented family labour, allowing the system to produce beyond what household subsistence required, generating surplus that fed the urban population not directly involved in agriculture. There was also specialised knowledge that developed around Chinampa farming. Some families became experts in particular crops, breeding varieties adapted to specific conditions. Others specialised in tree management, knowing which willow cultivars rooted best, which pruning techniques maximised stability while minimising shade. Still others focused on the hydraulic system, understanding water flow and pressure in ways that bordered on engineering. This specialization meant that the system as a whole contained more knowledge than any individual possessed. It was collective intelligence, distributed across thousands of families, each contributing their specific expertise to the functioning whole. The deeper mystery, then, was not technological but social. How did the Mexica create and maintain the organizational structures necessary to make Chinampa agriculture work at scale? How did they balance individual autonomy with collective coordination? How did they transmit complex knowledge across generations without writing, relying instead on practice and oral tradition? The answers were embedded in culture, in social structures, in ways of thinking about land and labor and community responsibility that the Spanish either did not recognize or actively destroyed. By the time modern researchers thought to ask these questions, much of the cultural context had been lost. The Chinampas in Xochimilco still function, but they operate within a modern market economy, individualized, simplified, stripped of the elaborate social framework that once sustained thousands of them. What remains is evidence of achievement without complete understanding of how that achievement was sustained. We know the Chinampas fed 200,000 souls. We know they did so for centuries. We can measure their productivity, analyze their structure, even recreate them experimentally. But the deeper knowledge, the social and cultural wisdom that made them possible, that we can only partially reconstruct. It is a mystery wrapped inside the evidence, a reminder that some human accomplishments depend on more than technology, that the real innovation is often the social structures that allow technical knowledge to flourish. 1519 was the year the world changed, though few people recognized it at the time. Moctezuma II, Emperor of the Mexica, stood on the roof of his palace in Tenochtitlan and looked out across the city he ruled. The Chinampas spread before him like a green carpet on the waters of Lake Texcoco, farmers working in the early morning light, canoes moving through the canals carrying produce to the great market at Tlatelolco. It was a scene he had witnessed countless mornings, evidence of abundance, of the empire's prosperity and power. But that morning in November 1519 was different. Messengers had brought news. Strangers were approaching, pale-skinned men riding enormous deer-like creatures, accompanied by warriors from rival cities. Tlaxcala and other states the Mexica had dominated through warfare and tribute demands. The strangers had crossed mountains and defeated armies. They seemed to possess weapons that roared like thunder and killed from a distance, and they were coming to Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma faced a choice that would determine the fate of his empire and the civilization that had built gardens on water. He could order the causeways destroyed, isolate Tenochtitlan on its island, force the strangers to assault across water, where their strange animals would be useless and their weapons less effective. Or he could welcome them, invite them into the city, attempt diplomacy rather than immediate warfare. He chose welcome. The reasons remain debated by historians. Some suggest he believed the strangers might be gods, or representatives of gods from Mexica prophecy. Others argue he was buying time, assessing the threat before committing to open conflict. Still others point to political calculation, the knowledge that his empire was overstretched, that many conquered peoples resented Mexica domination and might ally with the newcomers. Whatever his reasoning, the decision proved catastrophic. Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, as guests. They were housed in the palace of Xochimilco, Moctezuma's predecessor. They were shown the city's wonders, the great temple complex at its centre, the markets, the aviaries and zoos, the treasury filled with gold and precious stones, and they were taken to see the Chinampas. Spanish accounts mention the tour, describe Moctezuma's pride in showing the strangers how his people cultivated the lake. The emperor, it seems, did not yet understand that the men he was entertaining viewed everything in terms of conquest and extraction, that they saw his city not as a civilization to be respected, but as wealth to be taken. The turning point came in spring 1520, during Toxcatl, a major religious festival. Moctezuma had become essentially a prisoner in his own palace, surrounded by Spanish soldiers ostensibly for his protection, but actually as leverage. The festival proceeded without him. Thousands of Mexican nobles gathered in the temple complex for ceremonies, unarmed according to religious custom, dressed in their finest regalia. Cortés was away from the city, dealing with a rival Spanish force that had arrived to arrest him for unauthorized conquest. He had left Pedro de Alvarado in command. Alvarado, nervous about the gathering of Mexica nobility, convinced that they were planning an attack, ordered his men to seal the temple complex and massacre everyone inside. The slaughter was comprehensive and deliberate. Spanish soldiers blocked exits and killed systematically, cutting down unarmed people who had come to worship. When it was over, the temple square was carpeted with bodies, the flower of Mexica nobility dead, their blood pooling on stones where hours before there had been music and prayer. The city exploded into rage. Whatever tentative accommodation had existed between the Mexica and the Spanish invaders died in that moment. Warriors gathered, furious at the betrayal. The causeways were cut. The palace where the Spanish had taken refuge came under siege. Moctezuma, brought out to calm his people, was struck by stones thrown by his own subjects. Whether the wounds killed him, or whether the Spanish murdered him shortly after, is unclear. Either way, the emperor who had welcomed the strangers, who had tried diplomacy, died in June 1520, his authority destroyed, his city in chaos. Cortés returned to find Tenochtitlan in full rebellion. On June 30th, 1520, the night Spanish histories call La Noche Triste, the sad night, the Conquistadors attempted to flee the city. They loaded as much gold as they could carry and tried to escape across the western causeway under cover of darkness. The Mexica were waiting. Warriors in canoes attacked from the water. The causeway's bridges had been removed. Spanish soldiers, weighted down by gold and armour, fell into the lake and drowned by the hundreds. Those who made it across were harried for days as they retreated toward Tlaxcala. Cortés survived, though more than half his men did not. The alliance with Tlaxcala held, and within a year he would return, this time with a different strategy. Not assault across the causeways, but siege. Cut the city off from the mainland, starve it, prevent farmers from working the Chinampas, destroy the agricultural base that made Tenochtitlan's size and power possible. The turning point was not a single battle or event, but a realization. The Spanish understood, after La Noche Triste, that Tenochtitlan could not be taken by direct assault as long as it controlled the water. The Chinampas, the source of the city's abundance, became targets. The lake system that sustained them became something to be disrupted, poisoned, destroyed. The Mexica understood after the Tlaxcala massacre that the Spanish were not partners to be negotiated with, but existential threats to be expelled or exterminated. There would be no middle ground, no coexistence, only survival or annihilation. For the Chinampas, the turning point meant the beginning of the end. They had survived wars before, political upheavals, droughts, floods. But they had never faced an enemy whose goal was not conquest but replacement, who saw the lake not as an asset but as an obstacle, who wanted to drain the water and impose a different vision of how land should be used. That vision would ultimately triumph, but not easily and not quickly. The siege of Tenochtitlan would last months. The fighting would be brutal. Disease, particularly smallpox, would kill more people than combat, and, when the city finally fell in August 1521, it would mark not just a military victory, but the beginning of a cultural transformation that would attempt to erase the knowledge of how to build gardens on water. But on that November day in 1519, when Moctezuma made his choice, none of this was certain yet. The Chinampas still functioned. The city still thrived. The future hung in balance, tipping toward catastrophe, but not yet fallen. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 75 days. Cortés returned in May 1521 with a new army, Spanish reinforcements and tens of thousands of indigenous allies from cities that had chafed under Mexica domination. But this time, he did not attempt to storm the causeways. Instead, he built ships, 13 brigantines constructed from timber cut in the mountains and carried in pieces to the lakeshore, assembled and launched with cannon mounted on their decks. These ships gave the Spanish control of the water, the very element that had protected Tenochtitlan. They could intercept canoes bringing food from the Chinampas. They could attack defenders from unexpected directions. They could prevent escape or reinforcement. The Mexica, despite their maritime tradition, had no vessels that could match ships designed for ocean warfare. The Chinampas became battlegrounds. Spanish brigantines sailed through the canals, their cannon destroying the willow trees that held the gardens together, their soldiers setting fire to crops ready for harvest. Mexica warriors fought back from Chinampas turned into fortifications, using the narrow canals as defensive positions. but they were fighting a losing battle against superior firepower and logistics. Food shortages began within weeks. The Chinampas that could still be worked were isolated, cut off from the city by Spanish ships. Those close to Tenochtitlan came under constant attack. Farmers who tried to tend their plots were killed or driven off. The elaborate system of water management that kept the Chinampas productive began to fail as dikes were breached and sluice gates destroyed. Inside Tenochtitlan, the population that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands began to starve. The reserves of dried maize and beans ran out. People ate anything they could find, dogs and rats, leather and bark, weeds growing between the paving stones. Spanish accounts describe bodies lying in the streets, too many for the living to bury, disease spreading through a population weakened by hunger and warfare. Cuauhtémoc, the last Mexica emperor, organized defense with the desperation of someone who understood this was not just a battle, but the end of a world. He was young, in his mid-20s, chosen to lead after smallpox had killed much of the nobility. He rallied warriors, ordered sorties against Spanish positions, tried to break the siege by attacking the camps on the mainland. But the defenders grew weaker, while the attackers grew stronger. More Spanish reinforcements arrived from the coast. More indigenous allies joined what they now recognized as the winning side. The brigantines tightened their control of the water, cutting off not just food but fresh water, for Lake Texcoco's salt content made its water undrinkable without mixing with fresh water from the southern lakes. By August 1521, 3 months into the siege, Tenochtitlan was dying. The defenders fought from house to house, from canal to canal, but they fought without hope, knowing only that surrender meant slavery or execution. The Chinampas that still existed were battlefields scarred by fire and cannon, their productive capacity destroyed even if their basic structure remained. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape by canoe, hoping to reach the mainland and continue resistance from there. He was captured by Spanish sailors. Brought before Cortés, he asked to be killed, saying he had done everything in his power to defend his city and his people. Cortés instead kept him alive as a political tool, torturing him later to reveal the location of treasure that probably did not exist. With their emperor captured, the remaining defenders surrendered. The Spanish entered a city of corpses and ruins. Diaz del Castillo, who had marvelled at Tenochtitlan's beauty 2 years earlier, wrote that the stench was unbearable, that they could not walk without stepping on bodies, that the great city he had compared to an enchantment now looked like something from hell. And then the systematic destruction began. What the siege had damaged, Spanish engineers now deliberately demolished. The temples were torn down, their stones used to build Catholic churches. The palaces were razed, the causeways were widened and reinforced to support Spanish wagon traffic. And most consequentially for the Chinampas, decisions were made about the lake. The Spanish did not understand the lake. It flooded unpredictably, covering streets during rainy season. The water was brackish, unpleasant to drink. The canals seemed unsanitary to people accustomed to European cities where water was channeled underground in sewers. And the lake prevented the kind of urban expansion the Spanish envisioned, restricting the city to its island location when they wanted to build outward in all directions. So they decided to drain it. Not all at once, the engineering challenges were too great, but systematically, over decades and then centuries. The first major drainage project began in 1607, less than a century after conquest. A canal was cut through the mountains to the north, directing water out of the valley. Dikes were built to separate sections of the lake, allowing parts to be drained while maintaining others. Each drainage project destroyed more Chinampas. The gardens depended on specific water levels, on the balance between lake and land that the Mexica hydraulic system had carefully maintained. As water levels dropped, Chinampas dried out, their willow trees dying, their soil structure collapsing without the support of water beneath. Some gardens transformed into solid ground, no longer floating or semi-aquatic, but ordinary fields, their special characteristics lost. Other Chinampas simply disappeared, abandoned as the farmers who had worked them died in epidemics or fled to rural areas to escape Spanish labour demands. The knowledge of how to build and maintain them began to fade. Young people born after conquest were taught Spanish agricultural methods, ploughing and draft animals, the three-field system imported from Europe. The old ways were dismissed as primitive, inefficient, unsuited to a properly Christian and civilized society. By 1600, 80 years after first contact, the Chinampa system had shrunk to a fraction of its pre-conquest extent. Thousands of hectares of productive gardens had become dry land or open water. The elaborate network of canals had been partially filled in or allowed to silt up. The dikes and sluice gates had fallen into disrepair or been deliberately destroyed. Mexico City expanded onto the drained lake bed, building over the buried remains of Chinampas, paving streets where gardens had once floated. The consequences were both immediate and long-term. Food production declined. The city that had once fed itself from its own lake now depended on food brought in from distant regions. Floods became worse, the natural storage capacity of the lake system destroyed, water that once spread across thousands of hectares of Chinampas now rushing through a reduced area. The environmental consequences took longer to become apparent. The lake had been an ecosystem, supporting fish and birds and aquatic plants, moderating the valley's climate, filtering water through wetland vegetation. As it was drained, that ecosystem collapsed. The climate became more extreme, hotter in summer without the cooling effect of the water, dustier as former lake beds dried and their sediments blew in the wind. But in 1521, as the conquest ended and the draining began, these long-term consequences were invisible. What people saw was a military victory, a pagan city conquered for god and king, an obstacle to Spanish settlement being systematically removed. The Chinampas, the gardens that should not float, were being drowned in air, killed by the absence of the water that had given them life. Paradise was being drained away, replaced by a vision of land use that saw water as enemy rather than partner, that valued solid ground over the productive liminal space the Mexica had created. The fall was both sudden and gradual, sudden in the violence of conquest, in the deliberate destruction of the siege, gradual in the centuries-long process of drainage and forgetting, as Mexico transformed from a lake-centered civilization to a land-centered one, as knowledge was lost and gardens vanished beneath streets and buildings. What rose from the ruins was a different city, a Spanish city, built on the bones of what had been destroyed. But what fell was irreplaceable, a way of understanding and working with water that the world would not see again. The destruction of the Chinampas had consequences that rippled far beyond the Valley of Mexico, shaping agricultural thinking and environmental practice in ways that persist to this day. First, there was the immediate impact on food security in colonial Mexico. The Spanish replaced one of history's most productive agricultural systems with imported European methods that were poorly suited to local conditions. Wheat, the Spanish staple grain, required different soil and climate than the Valley of Mexico provided. Cattle and horses, introduced to the Americas, needed grazing land and fodder crops. The colonial agricultural system produced less food from more land than the Chinampas had, creating periodic famines where abundance had once existed. This pattern repeated across Latin America. Indigenous agricultural systems, adapted through centuries to local environments, were dismissed as primitive and replaced with European models based on very different ecological assumptions. In Peru, elaborate terrace systems in the Andes were abandoned. In the Amazon, sophisticated soil management techniques that created the dark, fertile earth called terra preta were forgotten. The loss represented not just destruction of infrastructure but erasure of knowledge. Agricultural science developed independently, and in many cases more sustainably than European equivalents. The environmental impact was perhaps even more consequential. The draining of the Valley of Mexico's lakes eliminated one of the world's most important wetland ecosystems. Wetlands provide crucial services, filtering water, storing floodwaters, supporting biodiversity, moderating local climate. The lakes had done all of this while also producing food through the Chinampas. Their destruction created problems that Mexico City struggles with to this day. Flooding became catastrophic without the lake system's natural storage capacity. Major floods hit Mexico City in 1629, 1634, and repeatedly throughout the colonial period. The Spanish response was to drain more water, dig deeper canals, build higher dikes. But they were fighting the valley's natural hydrology, trying to impose European solutions on a landscape that functioned differently. By the 20th century, Mexico City faced water crises from both excess and scarcity. During rainy season, flooding threatened neighborhoods built on the former lakebed, ground that compacted and subsided without water to support it. During dry season, the city struggled to supply millions of inhabitants with fresh water, having destroyed the aquifer recharge that the wetlands had provided. The subsidence problem proved particularly severe. Mexico City has sunk more than 10 meters in some areas since the colonial period. Buildings tilting and streets buckling as the ancient lakebed compressed without water in the underlying sediments. Engineers call it one of the world's most dramatic examples of urban subsidence, a slow-motion disaster caused by draining an ecosystem that should have been preserved. But the impact of the Chinampas extended beyond environmental and agricultural concerns. They influenced how different cultures thought about land use, cultivation, and the relationship between humans and water. In Europe, the Chinampas became a reference point in agricultural debates. Enlightenment thinkers used them as examples when arguing about the nature of progress and civilization. Were the Chinampas evidence that non-European peoples could achieve genuine innovation? Or were they clever adaptations that still fell short of European agricultural science? The answers people gave revealed their assumptions about race, culture, and the meaning of progress. Some argued that the Chinampas proved all humans were equally capable of innovation, that differences in technological development reflected environment and history rather than inherent ability. Others maintained that the Chinampas were ingenious but ultimately primitive, that they worked through trial and error rather than scientific understanding, and would have been improved by application of European methods. These debates, conducted in salons and universities by people who had never seen a Chinampa, had real-world consequences. They influenced colonial policy, shaped how indigenous knowledge was valued or dismissed, affected decisions about education and agricultural development throughout the Americas. In the 20th century, as modern agriculture faced increasing criticism for environmental damage and unsustainability, the Chinampas experienced a renaissance in scholarly attention. Agricultural scientists studying sustainable farming methods pointed to them as historical proof that highly productive agriculture could be ecologically balanced, that traditional knowledge sometimes exceeded modern practice. The Chinampas influenced the development of permaculture, organic farming movements, and contemporary discussions about food security in urban environments. Urban planners looked at them as models for integrating food production into cities, for using wetlands productively rather than draining or filling them. In Mexico, the Chinampas became symbols of indigenous achievement, sources of national pride after centuries of being dismissed as relics of a primitive past. The surviving Chinampas in Xochimilco were promoted as tourist attractions and cultural heritage sites. Farmers who had been marginalized were now celebrated as guardians of ancient wisdom. This created its own complications. Tourism brought money but also degradation, boat traffic polluting canals, visitors treating working farms as theme parks. The revival of interest came too late to save most of the traditional knowledge, which had been eroding for generations. Young people in Xochimilco often preferred urban jobs to the hard labour of Chinampa farming, despite romantic celebration of agricultural tradition. But perhaps the most profound impact was conceptual. The Chinampas challenged and continue to challenge assumptions about the relationship between cultivation and solid ground, about what agriculture requires and what it can achieve. They proved that farming does not necessarily mean ploughing fields, that productivity does not require mechanization, that sustainability is possible with traditional methods if those methods are based on deep understanding of local ecology. They demonstrated that water is not inherently an obstacle to agriculture, but can be a partner in it, that wetlands are not wasteland but potentially the most productive landscapes. These insights influenced environmental thinking globally. When scientists and policymakers debate how to feed growing urban populations sustainably, when they design constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment, when they argue for preserving rather than draining marshlands, they are working with concepts the Chinampas helped establish. The impact is diffuse, hard to trace directly, woven into contemporary consciousness in ways that often go unrecognized. But it is real. The floating gardens shaped the world they were destroyed in, influenced the civilization that replaced them, and continue to offer lessons to a future struggling with food security and environmental sustainability. From the ruins of paradise, seeds of understanding grew. Not enough to save what was lost, but perhaps enough to prevent some losses yet to come. The Chinampas demonstrated possibilities that remain relevant centuries after most of them disappeared beneath streets and buildings and the forgetfulness of time. Behind the grand narrative of empire and conquest, behind the agricultural statistics and environmental impacts, there were people. families who woke before dawn to tend gardens on water, children who learned to pole canoes before they learned to walk steadily on land, elders who carried in their memories the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Their names, for the most part, are lost. The Spanish chronicles recorded emperors and nobles, warriors and priests, the people who shaped politics and war. But the farmers who actually built and maintained the Chinampas, who did the patient daily work that made the system function, they appear in the historical record only as numbers, as tax assessments, as labour obligations. Yet fragments of their lives survive, glimpses preserved in unexpected places. In the Florentine Codex compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún in the mid-1500s, there are descriptions of daily life in pre-conquest Mexico. The text mentions Chinampa farmers, their work described with details that could only come from first-hand observation or interview. They rose before dawn, these farmers, when mist still lay thick on the water and the first light was just touching the peaks of the surrounding mountains. They poled their canoes through the narrow canals, checking plants for signs of disease or pest damage, harvesting crops that had ripened overnight. Some mornings they would dredge mud from the canal bottoms, loading their canoes with the rich sediment that would replenish the Chinampa soil. The work was constant but seasonal in its rhythms. Planting followed patterns determined by generations of observation, adjusted for each year's specific weather. The farmers knew which days were propitious for certain crops, not from abstract calendars but from reading the environment, watching for the return of migratory birds or the flowering of particular aquatic plants. Women played crucial roles, though their work is even less visible in the historical record than men's. They selected seeds, choosing the best specimens from each harvest to plant the next season, conducting genetic selection that shaped crop varieties over centuries. They managed the harvest processing, drying maize and beans for storage, preparing fresh vegetables for market. They often handled the financial side, selling produce in the great markets, negotiating prices, managing household economy. Children were integrated into the work from early ages. A toddler might ride in a canoe with their father, watching the work, absorbing knowledge through observation. By 5 or 6, they would be given simple tasks, pulling weeds or collecting eggs from ducks that lived on the canals. Teenagers took on adult responsibilities, managing their own sections of the family Chinampa, learning through practice the skills they would pass to their own children. There was art in this work, though it was never called that. The spacing of plants, the geometry of the rectangular plots, the pruning of willow trees so they provided stability without too much shade. All of this required aesthetic judgment as well as practical knowledge. A well-maintained Chinampa was beautiful, a harmonious integration of human cultivation and natural growth. There was also community. The Chinampas were not isolated plots but parts of an interconnected system. Neighbouring families helped each other during large projects, collective dredging operations or repairs to shared canal walls. Knowledge was shared, successful techniques spreading through conversation and observation. Elders were respected as sources of wisdom, their experience valued when unusual problems arose. One fragment from a colonial-era court document mentions a woman named Xochimilco, not the goddess, but an actual person who appears in a property dispute in 1568. She was defending her family's right to a Chinampa they had worked for at least 5 generations. The Spanish magistrate recording the case was clearly confused by her testimony, which described inheritance customs he did not understand, work patterns that made no sense in European agricultural terms. But through his confusion, a person emerges, a woman in her 50s or 60s describing with precision the location of her family's Chinampa, the willow trees her great-grandfather had planted at its corners, the mix of crops they traditionally grew, the agreements they had with neighbouring families about canal maintenance. She spoke with authority about agricultural matters, held legal title in her own name, expected to be taken seriously by the Spanish court system. The document does not record whether she won her case, but it preserves her voice, one of the few Chinampa farmers to speak directly across the centuries, to be more than a statistic or generalized description. There were losses beyond the physical destruction of the Chinampas. Each abandoned garden represented a family displaced, knowledge discontinued, a chain of transmission broken. An elderly farmer who died without passing on specialized skills took irreplaceable understanding with them. A young person who chose to seek work in the Spanish colonial economy rather than continue farming represented a break in cultural continuity, a decision repeated thousands of times across generations. The emotional impact is harder to trace but no less real. Imagine being a Chinampa farmer in the years after conquest, watching the lake system your family had tended for generations deteriorate, seeing the dikes that controlled water levels fall into disrepair, watching Spanish engineers drain sections of the lake, stranding your Chinampa on dry ground or flooding it beyond recovery. Knowing the knowledge your grandfather taught you would not be passed to your grandchildren because there would be no Chinampas for them to work. Some farmers adapted, transitioning to Spanish-style agriculture, learning to plough fields that had been lake bottom. Others moved to areas where Chinampas still functioned, concentrating in Xochimilco and a few other locations where geography or politics had temporarily preserved the old system. Still others simply stopped farming, drifting to the growing colonial city to seek work as labourers or servants. But some resisted in quieter ways. They maintained knowledge even when there were no Chinampas to apply it to, telling children and grandchildren about the old methods, preserving seed varieties, keeping alive the possibility that someday conditions might change. They were the ones who made possible the survival, in limited form, of Chinampa agriculture into the modern era. In Xochimilco today, if you talk to elderly farmers, you can still hear echoes of those voices. They speak about their work with a mixture of pride and sadness, proud of maintaining traditional methods, sad about what has been lost, uncertain about the future. They are the last links in a chain stretching back to that moment when someone first staked out a rectangle in the shallows and began building earth where earth should not exist. They are the forgotten voices of a forgotten world, but they spoke. They worked. They created abundance from water and mud and patient knowledge. Their names may be lost, but their achievement endures in the few surviving Chinampas, in the genetic heritage of crop varieties they bred, in the understanding that agriculture can be more than extraction, can be partnership between human cultivation and natural process. They deserve to be remembered, these farmers who built gardens on water. Not as abstractions or examples, but as people, complex and particular, living specific lives in a specific time and place, making choices that shaped not just their own families but the future of agriculture and environmental thinking. Not everyone accepted the destruction of the Chinampas quietly. From the earliest days of Spanish colonial rule, there were indigenous communities that resisted the draining of the lakes and the imposition of European agricultural methods. This resistance took many forms, from legal challenges in colonial courts to quiet defiance, continuing to farm Chinampas even when Spanish authorities discouraged or prohibited it. The legal resistance began surprisingly early. In 1544, just 23 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, representatives from several indigenous communities filed a formal complaint with the colonial viceroy. The complaint, recorded in Spanish but likely translated from Nahuatl, argued that the Spanish drainage projects were damaging Chinampas, disrupting water levels that had been carefully managed for generations, destroying agricultural infrastructure that fed thousands of families. The petitioners asked for the drainage to stop, for the old hydraulic system to be restored, for recognition that indigenous knowledge about water management exceeded Spanish understanding. It was a bold request, asking colonial authorities to admit that the people they had conquered knew more about the local environment than the engineers imported from Spain. The viceroy's response was dismissive. He acknowledged that some Chinampas were being affected, but argued that this was acceptable collateral damage in the larger project of transforming the valley into something more suitable for Spanish civilization. He suggested that affected farmers transition to European-style agriculture, that they stop clinging to primitive methods and embrace progress. The petition failed, but it established a pattern. Throughout the colonial period, indigenous communities filed similar complaints, each one documented in the archives, each one ultimately rejected. But they kept trying, using the Spanish legal system against itself, insisting that even under colonial law, they had rights that should be respected. There was also physical resistance, though it rarely took the form of open rebellion. Instead, communities developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining Chinampas despite official discouragement. In areas where Spanish oversight was weak, farmers would rebuild dikes that had been destroyed, re-establish water management systems, continue traditional cultivation methods while paying lip service to Spanish agricultural requirements. Some communities developed dual systems. They maintained Spanish-style fields for tax assessment purposes, growing wheat and other European crops in quantities sufficient to satisfy colonial demands. But they also secretly maintained Chinampas, hidden in remote sections of the lake, producing food for local consumption using traditional methods. This required careful coordination, entire communities conspiring to conceal their continued use of prohibited or discouraged practices. The resistance was not always successful. Spanish authorities periodically cracked down, destroying Chinampas they discovered, punishing communities they caught evading agricultural regulations. But the fact that such crackdowns were necessary, that they had to be repeated generation after generation, indicates that resistance persisted despite the risks. Religious resistance intertwined with agricultural resistance. The Chinampas had spiritual significance in Mexica cosmology, connected to Xochimilco, the goddess of streams and lakes, and to agricultural ceremonies that marked planting and harvest seasons. Spanish Franciscan and Dominican friars worked to eradicate these practices, viewing them as pagan rituals incompatible with Christianity. But indigenous communities preserved elements of the old beliefs, syncretizing them with Catholic practices in ways that allowed covert continuation. They would bless Chinampas with holy water while quietly invoking Xochimilco. They would celebrate Catholic saints' days on dates that coincided with traditional agricultural festivals, performing rituals that served both Christian and traditional purposes. This spiritual resistance was about more than religion. It represented a refusal to completely abandon indigenous identity, a determination to preserve cultural knowledge even when practicing it openly was dangerous. The ceremonies associated with Chinampa agriculture carried agricultural information, planting calendars encoded in ritual timing, knowledge about water and crops embedded in stories about gods and heroes. By maintaining the ceremonies, even in altered form, communities preserved some of the agricultural knowledge those ceremonies contained. It was a subtle form of resistance, easy to overlook, but crucial for the survival of traditional practices. There were also individual acts of defiance. Farmers who refused to abandon Chinampas even when economically rational to do so, maintaining plots that provided less income than wage labour would have, keeping the knowledge alive at personal cost. Teachers who secretly instructed children in Nahuatl and traditional knowledge, risking punishment to ensure the next generation retained connections to their heritage. Women played particularly important roles in this resistance. Colonial, Spanish society was intensely patriarchal, focusing surveillance and control on men. This created spaces where women could preserve knowledge and practices with less oversight. Mothers taught daughters traditional agricultural techniques, seed selection methods, stories about the Chinampas and the gods who had blessed them. Grandmothers became repositories of cultural memory, links between a past the Spanish were trying to erase and a future where indigenous identity might survive. The resistance faced internal challenges as well as external opposition. Not all indigenous people wanted to preserve the old ways. Some saw genuine advantages in Spanish methods, better opportunities in the colonial economy. Others simply wanted to survive and prosper, and resisting Spanish culture seemed counterproductive. Debates within communities could be as fierce as conflicts with Spanish authorities. Elders arguing for tradition versus young people arguing for adaptation. Farmers defending Chinampa agriculture versus neighbours who had successfully transitioned to Spanish methods and resented being asked to share in collective resistance. These internal divisions weakened resistance movements but also made them more realistic, more human, products of communities struggling with impossible choices rather than romantic depictions of unified indigenous opposition. By the 18th century, overt resistance had largely ended. Most of the lakes were drained, most Chinampas had disappeared. Spanish agricultural methods dominated the valley, but covert resistance continued, transformed into cultural preservation. The communities in Xochimilco that maintained Chinampas were no longer openly defying Spanish authority. They were simply farming in traditional ways, allowed to continue because they were marginal, economically insignificant, no longer a threat to colonial visions of agricultural development. This quiet persistence proved more effective than earlier overt resistance. The Chinampas that survived into the 20th and 21st centuries did so because communities continued working them generation after generation, preserving knowledge through practice rather than rebellion. They resisted by enduring, by refusing to let the gardens die completely, by maintaining that thread of continuity no matter how attenuated it became. The resistance was never entirely successful. It could not prevent the draining of most of the lake system, could not preserve the full extent of traditional knowledge, could not stop the transformation of the Valley of Mexico from a water-centered to a land-centered civilization. But it was not entirely unsuccessful either. The fact that any Chinampas survived, that any traditional knowledge persisted, that anyone in the modern era can study living examples of this ancient agricultural system, all of this exists because people resisted. They were not heroes in any simple sense. They were farmers and families making difficult choices, trying to preserve what they valued while adapting to overwhelming change. But their resistance mattered. It kept alive possibilities that might otherwise have been completely forgotten, maintained knowledge that contributes to contemporary discussions about sustainable agriculture and wetland conservation. The opposition to the Chinampas' destruction ultimately failed to prevent that destruction, but it succeeded in ensuring that failure was not total, that something survived to bear witness, to remind future generations what was lost and what barely was saved. For 300 years the Chinampas were dying, slowly being forgotten as relics of a superseded past. And then, in the early 20th century, something unexpected happened. People began to remember, to value what had been dismissed, to recognize in the floating gardens solutions to problems that modern Mexico was only beginning to understand it faced. The awakening began with artists and intellectuals rather than agricultural scientists or government planners. In the 1920s and 30s, following the Mexican Revolution, there was a surge of interest in indigenous heritage. Painters like Diego Rivera incorporated Chinampa scenes into murals celebrating pre-Hispanic civilization. Writers romanticized the gardens as symbols of a harmonious relationship between culture and nature, contrasting them with the environmental degradation of modern industrial agriculture. This artistic interest was partly nationalist mythology, part of the post-revolutionary construction of Mexican identity that emphasized indigenous roots and rejected the colonial legacy. But it created cultural space for the Chinampas to be valued rather than dismissed, to be seen as sophisticated rather than primitive, relevant rather than obsolete. The scientific awakening came later, building on the cultural groundwork artists had laid. In 1964, anthropologist Angel Palerme published a groundbreaking study of pre-Hispanic agriculture in the Valley of Mexico. Palerme argued that the Chinampas represented one of the most intensive and productive agricultural systems in human history, comparable to or exceeding the great irrigation civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia and China. His work challenged prevailing assumptions about indigenous capability. Western scholars had generally assumed that pre-Columbian civilizations were technologically inferior to European ones, that their achievements were limited by lack of certain key innovations like the wheel or draft animals. Palerme demonstrated that this assumption was wrong, that Mesoamerican peoples had developed sophisticated alternatives to European technologies, solutions that were in some ways more elegant and sustainable. His research inspired a generation of scholars to take indigenous agricultural systems seriously, to study them using modern scientific methods, to recognize that traditional knowledge could offer insights relevant to contemporary problems. The Chinampas became a focus of interdisciplinary research, attracting archaeologists, botanists, hydrologists, agricultural engineers, all bringing their specialized expertise to understanding how the system had worked. By the 1970s, this academic interest began influencing policy. Mexico City faced increasingly severe water problems, flooding during rainy season, scarcity during dry season, subsidence from overpumping groundwater. Some planners began to wonder if the Spanish had been wrong to drain the lakes, if the Mexico water management system might actually have been superior to what replaced it. This led to preservation efforts for the surviving Chinampas in Xochimilco. In 1987, UNESCO designated Xochimilco a World Heritage Site, recognizing both its historical importance and its continued function as a living agricultural system. The designation brought international attention and some funding for conservation, helping to slow the degradation that urban expansion had caused. But the real awakening happened at ground level, among the farmers and communities who had preserved Chinampa agriculture through centuries of marginalization. Suddenly, people were interested in what they knew, asking them to explain techniques that their grandparents had taught them, recognizing value in knowledge that had been dismissed as outdated. The attention was a mixed blessing. Tourism increased. bringing money but also pressure that degraded the very authenticity tourists came to see. Some farmers began performing Chinampa agriculture as spectacle rather than serious cultivation, catering to visitors' romantic expectations rather than maintaining productive systems. Others resented the sudden interest, suspicious of outsiders who wanted to study and document but offered little practical help with the real challenges of farming in an increasingly hostile urban environment. There were also genuine efforts at revival and innovation. Agricultural researchers worked with traditional farmers to experiment with improvements to Chinampa methods, testing whether modern techniques could be integrated without destroying the essential character of the system. Some experiments succeeded. Drip irrigation could increase water efficiency. Organic pest control methods could reduce crop losses without resorting to chemical pesticides that would pollute the canals. Other experiments failed or produced mixed results. Modern crop varieties, bred for industrial agriculture, often performed poorly in Chinampa conditions. Mechanization was difficult in the narrow spaces and wet soil. Attempts to scale up production using modern business models sometimes clashed with the communal and family-based organization that traditional Chinampa agriculture required. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new wave of interest emerged from the environmental movement. Climate change, soil degradation, water scarcity, all the challenges of 21st century agriculture made people look again at traditional systems that had sustained large populations sustainably over long periods. The Chinampas offered a model, not for wholesale adoption, but for principles that might inform contemporary practice. Urban planners became particularly interested. Cities worldwide were struggling to integrate food production into urban environments, to reduce dependence on long-distance food transport, to create green spaces that served ecological as well as aesthetic functions. Chinampa-inspired constructed wetlands began appearing in urban design proposals, not exact replicas, but systems that borrowed key concepts of integrating water management with food production. The awakening reached its fullest expression in the early 21st century, when a new generation of young Mexican farmers chose to work Chinampas, not from family obligation, but from deliberate choice. They were educated, often with university degrees, aware of global environmental issues, seeking to combine traditional knowledge with modern understanding. They approached Chinampa farming differently than their predecessors. They documented their work on social media, creating Instagram accounts that showed daily life on the Chinampas, YouTube channels explaining traditional techniques. They organized farmers' markets that highlighted Chinampa produce as local, organic, sustainably grown. They connected with international permaculture networks, positioning themselves as practitioners of cutting-edge sustainable agriculture rather than keepers of an obsolete tradition. This generational shift transformed how Chinampas were perceived. They were no longer just historical curiosities or tourist attractions, but active participants in contemporary debates about food, sustainability, and urban ecology. The young farmers became ambassadors, speaking at conferences, consulting on urban agriculture projects, teaching workshops on Chinampa construction and management. But the awakening remained fragile. Only a few hundred hectares of functioning Chinampas survived, a tiny fraction of the system's historical extent. Water quality in Xochimilco's canals continued to deteriorate despite conservation efforts. Urban expansion threatened the remaining areas. The number of people with traditional knowledge was small and aging, despite new interest from younger farmers. The Renaissance was real but incomplete, a recovery from near-total loss rather than a full restoration. The Chinampas would never again feed hundreds of thousands as they once had. The knowledge would never be as comprehensive as it had been before conquest. The system would never function at the integrated regional scale it had achieved at its height. But something had been saved. The floating gardens lived, not just in memory and historical record, but as working agricultural systems, producing food, supporting families, offering lessons to a world that increasingly recognized it needed to learn from traditions it had once dismissed. The awakening came centuries too late to save what was lost, but it came in time to preserve what remained, to recognize value before it disappeared completely, to give the Chinampas and the knowledge they embodied a future however uncertain. The deepest truth about the Chinampas is not that they worked, though that remains remarkable. It is not even that they were sustainable, producing abundance year after year without depleting resources, though that challenges modern agricultural assumptions. The deepest truth is what they reveal about the nature of innovation itself, about where knowledge comes from and how civilizations develop. We are taught, often implicitly, that technology moves in one direction, from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced, from trial and error to scientific method. The story we tell ourselves is that modern civilization, particularly Western industrial civilization, represents the pinnacle of human achievement, that everything before was a stepping stone toward our current sophistication. The Chinampas shatter that narrative. They represent agricultural science of a level that contemporary industrial farming has not achieved, despite all our machinery and chemistry and genetic engineering. Modern agriculture depletes soil, requires constant inputs of artificial fertilizer, depends on fossil fuels, generates pollution, contributes to climate change. The Chinampas did none of these things. They were genuinely sustainable, productive without being extractive, intensive without being destructive. This reveals something uncomfortable. The Mexica, working without writing systems in the modern sense, without formal scientific institutions, without the accumulated knowledge of European classical civilization, developed agricultural methods superior in important ways to those that replaced them. Not primitive methods that would be improved by contact with European science. Superior methods that were destroyed because Europeans could not recognize sophistication in forms that looked foreign. The revelation cuts deeper than agriculture. It questions the entire framework by which we judge technological and cultural achievement. The Spanish saw the Chinampas and decided they must be either floating rafts or some form of primitive ingenuity, because their own agricultural knowledge provided no category for what the Mexica had actually created. They literally could not see what was in front of them because they lacked the conceptual framework to recognize it. This blindness was not accidental or individual. It was structural, built into the assumptions of European colonialism. The entire project of conquest and colonization depended on the belief that Europeans represented civilization bringing light to darkness, that indigenous peoples were inferior and needed to be uplifted through conversion and cultural transformation. Recognizing indigenous technological superiority would undermine that justification, so evidence was ignored, misinterpreted, or actively suppressed. The Chinampas were described as floating rafts in official reports sent back to Spain, even though direct observation would have revealed they were not. Indigenous farmers' expertise was dismissed even when Spanish agricultural methods failed and indigenous methods succeeded. Knowledge was lost not through accident, but through willful ignorance. The blindness that comes from needing to see the world in certain ways to maintain certain beliefs about your own superiority. The revelation extends to how knowledge is transmitted and preserved. We tend to assume that writing is necessary for sophisticated knowledge systems, that oral cultures are limited in the complexity of information they can maintain across generations. The Chinampas demonstrate this assumption is false. The Mexica transmitted extraordinarily complex agricultural knowledge for centuries without written scientific texts. They did so through practice, through apprenticeship, through stories and ceremonies that encoded practical information in memorable forms. A child learning to tend Chinampas absorbed information not from books, but from participating, from watching skilled adults, from making mistakes and correcting them under guidance. This oral and practical transmission was in some ways more effective than written texts. It ensured that knowledge was embodied, that people understood not just what to do, but how it felt, how to read subtle signs in watercolour or plant growth that no written description could fully capture. It integrated knowledge into community structures, making its preservation a collective rather than individual responsibility. When the Spanish destroyed the Chinampas and suppressed traditional practices, they broke these transmission chains. The knowledge did not exist independently in libraries where it could be rediscovered. It existed in communities of practice, in the accumulated experience of farmers and families. When those communities were disrupted, when children were forbidden from learning traditional methods, the knowledge began to fade, not because it was written down and the books were burned, but because the living chains of transmission were severed. This reveals the vulnerability but also the resilience of oral knowledge systems. They can be destroyed more easily than written records, disrupted by policies that prevent practice or separate generations. But they can also persist in hidden ways, maintained by communities who quietly continue traditional practices, passed along in fragments that can be reassembled when conditions change. The deepest revelation, though, is about partnership versus dominance as approaches to the natural world. European agriculture in the colonial period was fundamentally extractive. It imposed human will on the landscape, clearing forests, draining wetlands, reshaping terrain to match. Imported visions of what farmland should look like. It saw nature as something to be conquered and controlled, resources to be exploited until depleted, then moved on from. The Chinampas represented a different philosophy. They worked with the lake rather than against it, understood its rhythms rather than trying to eliminate them, partnered with natural processes rather than seeking to dominate them. The Mexica did not conquer the lake. They learned how to collaborate with it, how to create an artificial ecosystem that functioned because it integrated with rather than replaced natural systems. This partnership approach yielded sustainability. The Chinampas could have continued indefinitely because they replenished what they used, because they enhanced rather than degraded the environment they depended on. European agriculture, for all its claims to superiority, could not match this achievement. It has consistently degraded soil, depleted water sources, destroyed ecosystems, requiring constant expansion to new territories as old ones were exhausted. The revelation is that the Mexica had solved problems we are still struggling with. They had created agriculture that was productive, sustainable, integrated with urban life and ecologically sound. We destroyed that system, dismissed the knowledge behind it, and then spent centuries learning the hard way that the methods we imposed were inadequate, that we had lost something we would struggle to rediscover. This is not to romanticize the Mexica or claim they were perfect environmental stewards in all domains. They were humans, like any others, capable of environmental damage and resource depletion in contexts where they lacked knowledge or where short-term pressures overrode long-term thinking. But in the specific domain of wetland agriculture, they achieved something extraordinary, something we are only now beginning to properly recognize and value. The deepest truth the Chinampas reveal is humbling. We are not the pinnacle of agricultural development. Indigenous peoples we once dismissed as primitive had knowledge we lost and are struggling to regain. Innovation does not move in only one direction. Sophistication takes many forms, and the destruction of knowledge, even when justified by claims of progress, represents loss that may take centuries to recognize and longer still to repair. The Chinampas are gone, mostly. What remains are fragments, echoes, a few hundred hectares in Xochimilco that survive more through stubbornness than support. But their absence speaks as loudly as their presence once did, teaching lessons we're only now ready to hear. We live in a world facing multiple crises that the Mexica had solved. Water scarcity in regions with abundant rain that falls at wrong times or in wrong patterns. Soil degradation from agricultural methods that extract more than they replenish. Food insecurity in growing cities that depend on supply chains vulnerable to disruption. Urban flooding from development that paves over wetlands that once absorbed excess water. These are our problems, challenges we struggle with despite all our technology and scientific knowledge. The Chinampas addressed all of these issues simultaneously. They conserved water by working with it rather than against it. They maintained soil fertility through constant replenishment from lake sediments. They produced food directly in urban areas, eliminating long supply chains. They functioned as flood control, absorbing and storing water during rainy periods. And they did all this while supporting biodiversity, creating habitat for fish and birds and aquatic plants that thrived in the managed wetland ecosystem. We destroyed this system. Not through ignorance, the Spanish knew what they were destroying, but through ideological commitment to a different vision, a belief that solid ground was inherently superior to wetland, that European agricultural methods were civilized while indigenous methods were primitive. We replaced a working system with one that created the very problems we now spend billions trying to solve. The reflection this demands is uncomfortable. How many other solutions have we destroyed? How much knowledge have we lost because it came from cultures we dismissed, because it was transmitted in ways we did not recognize as legitimate, because it challenged our assumptions about progress and development? The question is not abstract. Around the world, indigenous peoples maintain traditional knowledge systems about agriculture, water management, ecosystem stewardship, knowledge developed over millennia and adapted to specific local conditions. Much of this knowledge is at risk, threatened by the same forces that destroyed the Chinampas, economic pressure that makes traditional practices non-viable, educational systems that teach Western methods while dismissing indigenous approaches as backward, development policies that assume modernization means abandoning traditional ways. Every time we lose such knowledge, we repeat the mistake the Spanish made in the Valley of Mexico. We destroy solutions we may desperately need, dismissing them before we understand them, then later struggling to rediscover principles that were once common wisdom. But the reflection also offers hope. The awakening around the Chinampas demonstrates that lost or endangered knowledge can be valued again, that we can recognize and preserve what previous generations dismissed. The young farmers working Xochimilco's Chinampas are not just maintaining tradition. They are demonstrating that old knowledge remains relevant, that solutions developed centuries ago can address contemporary challenges. This suggests a path forward. Not romantic return to some imagined pristine past, not rejection of modern science and technology, but integration, synthesis, bringing together the best of traditional and contemporary knowledge, using modern understanding to explain and improve traditional practices, using traditional practices to challenge and correct modern assumptions. The Chinampas teach specific lessons about this integration. They show that intensive agriculture does not have to be destructive, that productivity and sustainability are not inherently contradictory. They demonstrate that working with natural processes can be more effective than trying to dominate them, that understanding ecology deeply can yield better results than attempting to replace ecology with chemistry. They also teach lessons about how we recognize and value knowledge. The Chinampas were sophisticated agricultural science, but they did not look like science as Europeans understood it. There were no written treatises, no formal experiments with controlled conditions, no mathematical models, just practice refined over generations, knowledge embedded in community traditions, understanding transmitted through demonstration and apprenticeship. We need to expand our definition of what counts as legitimate knowledge. Indigenous agricultural practices, traditional ecological knowledge, craft skills passed down through families, these are not primitive precursors to real science but different forms of knowledge, with their own strengths and applications. Sometimes they exceed contemporary scientific understanding. Sometimes they offer complementary insights. Always they deserve respect and serious study rather than dismissal. The reflection extends to our relationship with the natural world. We live in an era of environmental crisis, climate change and biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse, caused largely by our attempts to dominate nature rather than work with it. The Chinampas model a different approach, one that creates abundance through partnership, that enhances rather than degrades the environment. This partnership approach is not naive or romantic. The Mexica were not living in harmony with nature in some mystical sense. They were practical people solving practical problems, using intimate understanding of ecological processes to shape the environment for human benefit. But they shaped it in ways that maintained and even enhanced natural functions, creating a win for human welfare and ecological health simultaneously. We need that wisdom now more than ever. Climate adaptation will require working with natural systems rather than constantly fighting them. Sustainable agriculture will depend on understanding soil biology and water cycles and plant interactions rather than trying to replace them with industrial inputs. Urban development will need to integrate rather than eliminate natural processes, creating cities that function as ecosystems rather than as machines. The Chinampas cannot be simply replicated. The specific conditions that made them work, the lake system, the volcanic sediments, the highland tropical climate, do not exist everywhere. But the principles can be adapted. The understanding that created them can inform new solutions to local conditions. What we do with this understanding matters. The Chinampas offer us a choice, the same choice every generation faces when confronted with knowledge that challenges prevailing assumptions. We can dismiss it, as the Spanish did, insisting that our current methods are superior because they are ours. Or we can learn from it, humble ourselves enough to recognize that people we considered primitive had insights we lack, that there are multiple paths to knowledge, and we may have chosen unwisely in destroying some while privileging others. The reflection the Chinampas demand is ultimately about us, about who we are and who we choose to become. Will we be people who learn from the past or who insist on repeating its mistakes? Will we preserve diverse knowledge systems or allow them to be homogenized into a single approved way of thinking? Will we partner with the natural world or continue trying to conquer it until the conquest destroys us? These are the questions the floating gardens ask still, centuries after most of them sank beneath Mexico City's streets. They ask from Xochimilco, where a few still function. They ask from archaeological sites where their remnants wait beneath volcanic ash. They ask from the lessons they offer to a world that desperately needs wisdom it once destroyed. The sun rises over Xochimilco, painting the canals gold and orange, the same light that fell on these waters 500 years ago when the world was different and gardens covered the lakes like a promise of permanence. The farmers are already working, have been working since before dawn. An elderly man poles his canoe through narrow waterways, checking the Chinampas his family has tended for 6 generations. His granddaughter sits in the bow, learning the knowledge he learned from his grandfather, an unbroken chain stretching back into history, thinner now than it once was but not yet broken. They are tending lettuce and radishes today, crops for the weekend market in Mexico City. Not the same vegetables the Mexica grew, tastes have changed, markets demand different things, but the method is ancient, the same careful spreading of canal sediment, the same reading of water levels and plant health, the same partnership with the lake that sustained a civilization. Around them, the city encroaches. Mexico City has 20 million people now, one of the largest metropolitan areas on Earth, built on what was once lake bottom. The water is polluted, contaminated by runoff and sewage from neighborhoods that creep closer every year. The Chinampas that remain are a fraction of what existed, islands of traditional practice in a sea of modernity, but they persist, against economic pressure that makes farming barely viable, against pollution that threatens water quality, against urban expansion that turns agricultural land into subdivisions. They persist because the people who work them choose to persist, decide that maintaining this knowledge, this connection to the past, matters more than easier or more profitable alternatives. In the archaeological sites beneath Mexico City, the buried Chinampas wait, compressed layers of ancient soil and vegetation, preserved under volcanic ash and centuries of urban development. Researchers still study them, still discover new details about how the system worked. Every excavation for new construction potentially reveals more evidence, more fragments of the lost world. In archives across Mexico and Spain, the colonial-era documents preserve descriptions of what the Spanish found and destroyed. The letters of bewilderment, the administrative records, the legal disputes over water rights, all of them pieces of a puzzle that will never be complete, but that sketch the outline of what existed. In seed banks and botanical gardens, the crop varieties bred for Chinampa cultivation survive, genetic legacy of generations of selection and care. Some researchers work to revive these varieties, to reintroduce them to the surviving Chinampas, to preserve not just the agricultural method, but the specific plants adapted to it. In university departments and research institutions, scholars from multiple disciplines study the Chinampas, seeking to understand how they functioned, what made them sustainable, what lessons they offer for contemporary challenges. Their work ensures that knowledge continues to accumulate, that understanding deepens even as the physical system shrinks. In urban planning offices and agricultural development programs around the world, designers draw inspiration from the Chinampas, creating constructed wetlands, floating gardens, integrated aquatic agriculture systems. They are not exact replicas, the contexts are different, the challenges specific to local conditions. But they carry forward the core insight that water and cultivation can be partners rather than enemies. The legacy is fragmented like the system itself, not the grand integrated vision that once fed hundreds of thousands, but pieces, scattered across geography and disciplines and communities. Yet the pieces add up to something, not restoration of what was lost, that is impossible, but preservation of what remains and creation of what might come. The floating gardens will never again cover the Valley of Mexico. The lakes are gone, drained away, buried under concrete and asphalt. Mexico City has chosen a different path, committed to a vision of urban development that sees water as obstacle rather than opportunity. The consequences, the flooding and subsidence and water scarcity, demonstrate the cost of that choice. But in Xochimilco, on a few hundred hectares of canals and gardens, the knowledge survives. Not perfectly, simplified and adapted, but recognizably the same practice that built Earth on water and fed an empire. The farmers who work these Chinampas are the last links to a world that existed before conquest, before colonization, before the imposition of European visions on American landscapes. They are also pioneers of what might come next. In a world facing climate change and environmental degradation, Their methods represent possibilities that industrial agriculture has not achieved. Their gardens demonstrate that sustainability is possible, that intensive cultivation does not require extraction, that partnership with natural systems can produce abundance. The legacy of the Chinampas is written in stone, literally, in the volcanic rock that borders the canals, in the archaeological remains buried beneath the city. But it is also written in memory, in the stories elderly farmers tell their grandchildren, in the knowledge that passes from hand to hand with each planting and harvest. It is written in absence too, in the vanished lakes and lost gardens, in the empty spaces where knowledge once existed. The legacy is as much about what was destroyed as what was saved, a reminder of the fragility of human achievement, how easily sophisticated systems can be lost, how quickly knowledge can fade. But above all, the legacy is a question. What will we do with what remains? Will we preserve the surviving Chinampas or allow them to disappear completely? Will we learn from the knowledge they embody or dismiss it as irrelevant to modern concerns? Will we recognize the value of indigenous agricultural science or continue to privilege European-derived methods? The answers will be written by future generations, by the choices made in university research programs and government policies, in consumer decisions about food and farmer decisions about methods. The Chinampas cannot answer these questions. They can only ask them, offer evidence, demonstrate possibilities. The sun climbs higher over Xochimilco. The farmer and his granddaughter finish their work and pole their canoe back toward shore, the morning's harvest filling baskets in the stern. Behind them, the Chinampas lie green and productive, floating gardens that do not actually float but exist in that space between earth and water, between past and future, between what was lost and what might be saved. They have survived 500 years of suppression and neglect. They have outlasted empires and colonial regimes and modernization programs designed to eliminate them. They persist, stubborn and beautiful, testament to human ingenuity and cultural resilience, proof that some knowledge refuses to die no matter how thoroughly it is buried. As long as they exist, as long as someone tends gardens on water in the canals of Xochimilco, the legacy endures. Not just as history, not just as memory, but as living practice, working method, knowledge that produces food and flowers, and the possibility that we might yet learn from what we once destroyed. The Chinampas ask us to remember, but more than that they ask us to imagine. Imagine a different relationship between city and agriculture. Imagine sustainability not as sacrifice, but as abundance. Imagine learning from the past rather than repeating its mistakes. They are fragments of a lost world, these floating gardens. But fragments can teach, ruins can inspire, and sometimes what seems lost can be found again, not restored to original form, but adapted, renewed, given new purpose while honouring old wisdom. The sun shines on the canals, the willows grow, the gardens produce, and the legacy continues, written in water and earth, in practice and memory, in the patient work of keeping alive knowledge the world once tried to forget.